Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Monica Kilpatrick, and I serve as the Director of Connect Ministries for the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. As we get started, I would like to inform you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for future viewing on the NBA website at nbacares.org/prison-and-jail. This webinar continues our 2018 webinar series for NBA Prison and Jail Ministries. Today's topic is Restorative Justice 101. In a world where retributive justice has resulted in overcrowded prisons, a school-to-prison pipeline, and mass incarceration disproportionately affecting people of color, there is another way. The restorative justice movement continues to gain support and demonstrate a better way of addressing criminality in our country. This webinar will introduce the principles of restorative justice and share the power of its application by an experienced restorative justice practitioner and advocate. This webinar can be used as a tool for discussion and a call to action in congregations, regions, and general church ministries. At the end of this presentation, there will be time for questions. Throughout the webinar, if you have questions that emerge, we welcome you to use the Q&A feature by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. Please include your email address so that if we are unable to get to your question, we can follow up with you directly over the once the webinar is over. To request technical assistance, you may also use the Q&A feature. Again, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available for future use on the NBA website. So to begin, let me introduce our speakers. The Reverend Nora Jacob is an ordained disciples pastor who has served since 2013 as Restorative Justice Minister at Urban Mission, a United Church of Christ and Disciples of Christ joint new church start in South Pomona, California. Nora is also a co-founder and restorative justice director of the related nonprofit organization, Urban Mission Community Partners. Urban Mission Community Partners has been one of NBA's affiliate ministries since 2016. For more than 4 years, Nora has co-facilitated several restorative justice circles of accountability and healing each week with incarcerated students inside the California Institution for Men in Chino, California. She also works in reentry and reintegration of men and women returning to their communities after prison. In addition, she helps lead Inside Out Art, one of her restorative justice initiatives at UMCP, which promotes opportunities for currently and formerly incarcerated artists to share their creative work, encouraging conversations in the wider community about the role of art in personal and social transformation. And Reverend Dean Bucalis, an ordained clergy in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, is the founding pastor of New Life in Christ Christian Church, a congregation inside a women's prison in Louisville, Kentucky. He is currently the executive director of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, an ecumenical reentry program that trains small faith-based groups to work with ex-offenders upon their release from prison. MB3 is also an NBA Incubate and Connect partner. Dean is a trained volunteer facilitator for the Juvenile Justice Pilot in Jefferson County, Kentucky, sponsored by the Restorative Justice Louisville. And he currently serves as the mission specialist for NBA's Prison and Jail Ministries Affinity Group. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Dean and Nora.
Thank you, Monica. I want to welcome everyone to this webinar. This is really the second webinar we have included on restorative justice. The first one about 2 years ago focused on restorative justice as it related to the juvenile justice system. But the process of restorative justice continues to evolve, and we felt it was important to revisit that, to introduce people who haven't learned much about restorative justice over the past couple of years, and then provide an opportunity to hear from someone who has really been an integral part of the restorative justice movement in California. So we're delighted to have Nora with us. And I realize that while restorative justice is a term that many people may be familiar with, I was in a conversation with a friend of mine who's an attorney who does a lot of justice work, and mentioned that we were doing this webinar on restorative justice, and she said, well, I've heard about it, but I really don't know much about it, which encouraged me to want to participate in this particular webinar today. So restorative justice is not it's not a program. It's really a movement. I like this definition that's been provided by Prison Fellowship International, which says restorative justice is the theory of justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused or revealed by criminal behavior, and it's best accomplished through cooperative processes that include all stakeholders. One of the things that we want to talk a little bit about in laying the context for how all this works is just a brief background about restorative justice, what it is, and how it works, and why we even are concerned about it. Why do we need to learn about restorative justice? And so I think it's important for us to begin by looking at some assumptions. One of those assumptions is that our current correction system is just not working effectively. We have more people in prison in the United States than any place in the world, and a disproportionate number of people of color who are being incarcerated. We now call it mass incarceration. And we also know that there's this school to prison pipeline that has to be disrupted because so many of our young people are being placed in untenable positions where they're identified early on in their lives and just in some ways just sort of shuttered into this this prison system. And we also know that we're a litigious society. It used to be that small civil disputes in neighborhoods were resolved by neighbors or through the community. But we have become such a litigious society and have been so polarized that virtually every type of conflict now comes before the justice system, and our criminal system is overflowing. It's overwhelmed, and so because we've lost this sense of civil discourse and this context of resolving issues in our community, it's important for us to begin looking at another way. Because the system that we have now, our retributive justice system, is one that in some ways is effective for what its purposes are, but overall it's something that has created this somewhat of a monster of a criminal justice system where we have so many people now are incarcerated, because the retributive justice system really focuses on punishment. And it depends upon an adversarial system. It's where two parties come together, and somewhere the truth is discerned from that controversy, usually in the context of a court case. And it looks at punishment as a way to meet and resolve crime. There's really very little participation in the retributive justice system for people who are victimized. Sometimes there might be a victim statement or an opportunity for the victim to say something at a sentencing hearing, but so many cases are resolved even before they come to court. So many cases involve just focus on the defendant in a criminal trial, that the victim often doesn't have an opportunity to say anything or have a voice or participate in the process at all. And the system is really designed as a community protection as opposed to a place where we can find some healing and repair. And although it's one method of nonviolent conflict resolution, it really looks at this concept of deterrence as a way of preventing future criminal behavior. Restorative justice is a lot different. And it's an evolving movement that has some practices and principles that are much to the alternative of the retributive justice system. It's really not designed to be a replacement for that system, but it's designed to be an alternative, another opportunity, another way to resolve conflict in a nonviolent way. And one of the ways that it does this is focusing on restoration, reconciliation, and healing. And it brings different stakeholders to the table. It brings the offender, it brings the victim, and it brings community members as well to be a part of that cooperative process. And it seeks truth not through this adversarial process, but through a process of dialogue. And it purports to try to move to a place of order and peace and give voice to victims that they've never really had before. And we also know that this process, which once again is something that continues to evolve, is concerned with a wider sense of community healing and peace, with leaving our communities in a place where we can not only preserve the public order, but we can also live together in a more peaceful way. And it looks at this concept of encounter as a way of prevention, as opposed to this concept of punishment. So why, as the church, should we be concerned about this? Why is this something that we should know about? But what we know theologically is that one of the greatest overriding themes in the Bible is restoration and reconciliation. Reconciliation of people of God to one another, to God, and to all of creation. And we hear early on in our sacred text from Genesis about the brokenness and the violence and the alienation that has come from our turning away from God's way and God's plan. But we also hear through the stories as they continue to be told about God's plan to offer a vision of healing and wholeness in and through the community, one that's grounded in peace and in justice. And then we see this theme of restoration and reconciliation demonstrated most beautifully in the teachings of Jesus Christ, where we see resolving conflict in a nonviolent, peaceful way to be his way, caring for the victim of injustice, but also holding people accountable for their actions, and offering forgiveness when people are repentant, and moving people toward this reconciling love of God. So how does restorative justice work? How do these principles come into play? Well, there are four basic key values that restorative justice programs embrace: encounter, amends, reintegration, and inclusion. So the encounter piece is one that brings people together, the victims, the offenders, the community, who really want to meet with one another to discuss a particular event and its aftermath and the effects of that, and try to come together in their conversation and dialogue to a solution that is one that not only repairs the harm, but brings people together and offers forgiveness and repentance. Amends is that key component for the offender. In restorative justice practices, for an offender to really participate, they have to acknowledge and admit that they've done something wrong and that they've caused some harm, and that they are willing and interested in repairing that harm. So many people that I've worked with behind bars who have been in prison and have never seen or ever even been in contact with their victim, have this strong desire to say they're sorry, to have an opportunity to meet with with the people that they have victimized, to explain to them what was going on in their lives, and to apologize and try to make amends. Our system, as it exists now, the retributive justice system, has no place for that. But people who have turned their lives back over to God through Jesus Christ, who want to make amends, who are seeking forgiveness, often are left without any remedy. But the restorative justice system really does provide an opportunity for people to do that. And then the reintegration piece is important. It seeks to restore victims and offenders to a place of wholeness and healing, so that they can become contributing members of society, to bring that sense of reconciliation and restoration to the very community in which these people live. And inclusion. So as I mentioned before, in a lot of aspects of the retributive justice system, it's an adversarial system with just two parties actually in a contest for the truth. But the restorative justice model is one that includes people from the community. It includes the offender and it includes the victim, and it gives those stakeholders an opportunity to move toward a resolution. So having said that, having kind of set the context with a little bit of an understanding of how restorative justice is designed to work, it's my pleasure and delight to introduce Reverend Nora Jacob, who is a practitioner. And I always think that sometimes that it's often helpful once we hear about how things operate to actually discover what they look like in real life. So Nora, I'm going to turn it over to you to share the wonderful ministry that you're doing.
Thank you, Dean. Hello, everybody. I welcome you to this part of the webinar. The Urban Mission is a combination of a church and nonprofit, and if there were a mission statement to say about it, it is that we welcome the broken and partner in love. So that's the spirit that I carry in restorative justice, that it's a movement, well, it's a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. And so what I'd like to start with is to give you some context of what we're doing and then to walk you through some examples. So you see here a couple of or several organizations offer training for restorative justice practitioners. One that is nationwide, based in California, has been around for a couple of decades, is Insight Prison Project, which does training for not only restorative justice circle work for people in prisons, but also does one-on-one victim offender dialogue training and other activities. Possibilities for teamwork always exist because restorative justice practitioners are relatively small in number compared to those who are working around or in the criminal justice system. And so one example I lift up and invite you to take a look at is Healing Hearts Restoring Hope in Los Angeles, Catholic-based organization that does a great deal of work in California's prisons in particular. And its subtitle is Working with Victims of Homicide. And so they're, I think, a terrific model of the importance of involving everyone who's involved in harm and healing in the process of restoration. First thing I'd like to talk about is what one of the models that Insight Prison Project offers, the Victim Offender Education Group. And typically it's 12 to 15 participants, typically incarcerated for major harm. So now I'm moving into the work that I do at California Institution for Men in Chino. 12 to 15 participants, felony crimes, typically these are things like murder, attempted murder, great bodily injury, rape, aggravated assault. And in our state, sentencing enhancements still happen for gang-related crimes, for weapons. And so these are people who typically have been in the system for quite a while and are clear that they want to start doing something different with their lives. 2 to 3 facilitators, ideally from inside as well as outside. So once the classes start, we're always looking for people in the classes who, once they graduate, will become effective facilitators. And the importance of diversities in age, racial background, and crime. When you leave out the concept of what harm has been done, it strikes me that this is very much the way that many of our disciples' regions select their camp leadership, that we're always looking for that same kind of diversity and balance. And so the concept is the same, that we're looking to model something that is more inclusive and diverse. It's important that we sit in a circle in restorative justice activities. And so the importance of this is really more than symbolic. That symbolism says everyone's equal. We just, quote unquote, we have different roles there. Each person has his or her own truth. So it's far from the model of a hierarchy where one person brings in a special learning or expertise and speaks to the others. Each person has his or her own truth, and all are valued and respected as human beings. It's very powerful, especially in prison. A little story about that from early in the start of one of these groups, which at this point, these groups go for an average 18 to 24 months once a week for 2 hours each time. And one of the people who, as we were starting, we were building a covenant for how we would behave in our journey together. And one of the facilitators, a new facilitator, called this man by his last name. And so noticing that, we stopped and said to the facilitator, just want to note that part of our covenant is to call one another by our first names. And he immediately stopped and apologized to the person he'd referred to by last name. Understand that in prison, last name or number is the way human beings are referred to when they're spoken to directly. That person was so stunned. You could see it on his facial expression. And so when we asked, how does it feel to be recognized by your first name? How does it feel to shift over from the process you've gotten used to in prison to a more human model, what we think of as a more personal model? He said, I'm speechless. I can't begin to describe all that I'm feeling and the hope that's already happening. So this may seem small, but it plays out large. With those values of encounter and inclusion, some of what the participants in restorative justice circles seek is accountability, greater accountability for their crimes. They don't always understand the full ramifications. And they also seek greater self-understanding. The role of their parents, family, friends, not always clear. The cultural context or socioeconomic context, not at all clear. Often the role of trauma in their own lives is not clear to them. So one of the things we hear, especially at the beginning, is as we unpack people's stories and they share, is I just thought it was normal. I just thought it was normal that that men beat women. I just thought it was normal that children should be seen but not heard. And there were consequences for that, negative consequences for that. The self-understanding also encourages them to figure out where their negative triggers come from, because once you know what triggers you emotionally, then you can start working on better management of it. One of the value of reintegration, some of that is very much played out in some of the other qualities and practices that develop as time goes on in these circles. Building empathy, better managing one's own emotions and behaviors, and resilience. Empathy is walking a mile or walking in someone else's shoes, right? And so there's may not have been a lot of encouragement or understanding of the importance of empathy to being a positive, healthy contributor in one's society. And so as they hear one another's stories and understand how to reflect back and ask questions of one another, on their stories, the empathy naturally builds. I'll be telling a story about that in a couple of minutes. So reintegration and inclusion are played out as and developed as participants experience forgiveness of themselves and others, or at least, to be realistic, the start of it. It's very hard for most of them, just like it is for all of us. And let me just reframe it that way. It's hard for all of us to get to forgiveness immediately. And so it's a process. Another thing that the restorative justice process we follow provides is a connection with a survivor, a surrogate survivor to be sure, but a survivor who has experienced much the same kind of harm that the person who is working on healing and having done harm has carried out. And so it's the most powerful part of the program. It comes at the end, although we do a short version, I'll be talking about in a couple minutes, of a shorter version of introduction to all of this. And hearing someone share his or her story of what's happened, what it feels like to lose a loved one or to have one's life damaged in a way that causes trauma and lasting impact, and working on forgiveness, that is a tremendously powerful conversation. I remember one survivor who brought an article, a personal article from her son to the group and shared as we were having a survivor panel with the class. And this item was passed around from hand to hand, and it reached one of the participants who looked at it and started to cry and said, my mother is holding on to this same thing for me. That was a moment you couldn't script, but powerful connection to the reality of understanding both harm and healing and hope. And then, as Dean noted, working on amends is powerful. Usually that's indirect. Our current system does not promote and makes it challenging for people to meet one-on-one. It's really up to the victims, and that's appropriate. So they have to find other ways to make amends. So typical processes of a restorative justice circle in this context, especially that we're doing it in prison, everyone participates in the discussion, or one individual shares a written prepared assignment with the group, and then the facilitators and group members ask questions to promote that person's self-understanding and insights. It's very interesting. Judgment keeps coming up, especially at first, but this is not about judgment. This is about self-understanding and connecting with feelings. One person's insight often affects the whole group, especially for those who have been in and out of the prison system and have developed respect for the way they have managed to live their lives in this context. When that person shares something and says, for instance, I'm sharing this for the first time, or starts to share and face starts to quiver and the eyes start to water, then that sharing gives permission to everybody to share a little deeper, a little differently. It's very important to build trust, confidentiality, and respect from the start. These are things that you cannot command. These are things that people have to feel and be willing to participate in. So the reason that it takes as long as it does to get going is that we work on different exercises, participatory activities, to get people to start trusting one another and share confidentiality and respect. The saying of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, same thing for prison. Facilitation involves these kinds of behaviors: deep listening, language of noticing and wondering. I notice that you paused there for a moment. And when you did, I saw that your eyes filled with water, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you felt at that point. What was going on? One of my profs in seminary used this phrase, and it sums it all up for me. It's reverent curiosity. That's our job as facilitators and as human beings, I would say. To try the best we can not to judge what we're hearing, to be present, not teaching, not preaching, and not judging, but to be present to someone else's story and someone else's heart breaking open and discovering what he or she is going through and has gone through. One of the phrases we often use is sit with it. Sitting with it, whatever the it is, usually it's about feelings or about confusion. Sitting with it gives space for feelings. How many of us, wherever we are, rush through our lives, speaking through without processing our feelings? That's very clear here, and that's part of why people have gotten to the point of being incarcerated. Modeling acceptance of feelings and letting silence do the heavy lifting. Once, I'll share this other story now. Early on in the process, before the men had started to share their individual stories and crime impact statements, we were talking about how to identify feelings. And looking around this circle of 12 people and a couple of other facilitators, I could see that 3 of the 12 people from inside were just like rocking back and forth slightly. And then they'd stop. And so it wasn't that they were imitating one another. It was just that when things got a little emotionally tense, they'd rock. And so I finally chose one of them and just said very calmly and tenderly, I noticed that you've rocked back and forth a few times as this session has gone on. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about what you're feeling while you're doing that. And he answered, oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. I just rock from time to time. It feels good. So I said, okay. Can you remember the first time you ever noticed yourself rocking back and forth? I had no idea where this would go. And lo and behold, he said, yes, I was a child, and one of my parents used to, when that parent was high, would come home and just the first one of us kids they encountered, they would tie us up and beat us. And so it usually went on for a while. So I would rock back and forth as a way of comforting myself. It's hard. And I just gave you a little space to feel those feelings. So another program that we do at California Institution for Men is something that came out of Healing Hearts Restoring Hope called the Ripple Effect. And it's a workshop for people, whatever stage of their journey of incarceration, to promote basic understanding of the ripple effects of harm and of healing, because 2 of the related and fundamental principles of this work are hurt people, and healing people, heal people. This is real powerful. The way that we do this is, if you can screen on, typically there are 20 to 25 participants, 2 to 3 facilitators again. We in the outside have gathered actual crime scenarios from people we've worked with who are victims of crime. And with their consent, we've made them person neutral, but written out the actual crime scenario. And we have these role play cards, and we hand them out randomly so that each person gets one. And we read the crime scenario and then ask each person to pretend that they are the person whose role play card they've drawn. The mother of the offender, the cousin of the victim, the judge, the ambulance driver, the child of the offender. And so they role play as best they can, but the impact of it is powerful because for often the first time, they get the sense that yes, hundreds of people are typically affected by a given crime. We say roughly at least 200 people. I think it's probably more than that, because it's not just the victim himself or herself or themselves. It's the families, it's the friends, it's the church members, it's the schoolmates, it's people who follow the news, it's the community at large. It can go on and on, this impact. I had one man who role played the mother of the offender, which would have been his mother. And when we got to him sharing in the circle, he couldn't even speak. He was so choked up. And afterwards, when he had kind of regained his balance, he said, I never realized that my mother was a victim of what I did, in the sense of how harm happens and how healing happens. And that was real powerful. The other thing that the ripple effect does is simply to introduce these restorative justice concepts. So I'll wrap up by just saying a little bit about what we're doing at Urban Mission Community Partners, especially because that's the part of the urban mission that goes into prisons, that we're working on new programs responding to California's current emphasis on more rehabilitation, education, and restorative justice program opportunities, for those whose lives have been detoured by incarceration. And we're working on kind of modularizing some of these things around what we've been told that folks inside would like to work on: grief and loss, forgiveness, compassionate communication, and there's more. Restorative justice is a process, and once we apply, and I say this as my encouragement for all of us in churches, clergy, laypersons, or connected to justice work, it's everything we're working on in the outside world, and using restorative justice circles inside to work with a population that longs for this and whose healing from it would ripple effect positively to help be a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. So I'm going to turn it back now.
Thank you, Nora. That was so helpful, just to give us an idea of how these principles are put into practice. And what we want to share as well is that the restorative justice movement has many different aspects of how it manifests itself. So Nora's experience has been inside places of incarceration, and that's a unique aspect of the restorative justice movement, to work with people who are already incarcerated and help them work through some of the issues that they are confronting, and finding ways to create a healing presence in them. But there are other models that occur along the way for people. So restorative justice also is being played out in schools, in places where there may be, schools may be seeking alternatives to conflict resolution, and a way of bringing young people together in these restorative circles with members of the community as well as members of their school to work through some of these issues. There are programs. The one that I work with works with juvenile offenders, and these are folks who actually, young people who've committed a crime. They've admitted that they've committed a crime, and the judges have agreed to basically divert the resolution of their issues to a restorative justice program, Restorative Justice Louisville, where facilitators and victims and offenders get together and really have a conversation about what happened, why it happened, the harm that was done. The victim has an opportunity to share that. And then the offender can talk about how they're feeling about this, seeking forgiveness. And then the group together tries to find a resolution to that, to somehow repair the harm through community service, through other aspects. And then there are family group conferences that work in places where there are disruptive family circumstances. So there's a lot of different manifestations of restorative justice, and we wanted to share a couple of the resources here that you see on the screen. These small books are something that are very handleable, very readable, give you some how-tos in these particular areas. Howard Zehr is often noted as the grandfather of the restorative justice movement. It really hasn't. It's evolved over the last 30 or 40 years or so. And there's a program out of East Mennonite University that actually you can be trained in the principles of restorative justice. But there are many resources out there, and we want to encourage folks in our congregations to begin seeking those resources, to learn about ways in which they can become involved in restorative justice programs, or like Nora, like me, like many others, actually get involved in practicing some of these restorative justice principles in our communities. I'm going to turn it back over to Monica to field any questions that you all might have.
Well, excellent. Thank you, both Dean and Nora, for this powerful presentation and for helping us to think about other ways that we might live in community with one another. I think what I've learned is that restorative justice practices, certainly in the prison system and the schools, but there are also principles that I think we can choose in our daily lives together, in our homes and things too. So. I do have a few questions that I want to raise and invite you all to respond to. And the first is, let's see, do you do any restorative justice work with victims or survivors of crime? And if you do, what does that look like?
Well, I can, I'll address that, and then I'll turn it over to Nora. One of the more sensitive aspects of restorative justice is the involvement of people who have been victims. And for any restorative justice circle to be effective, the victim has to volunteer to participate. So it's a totally voluntary process for them. And what we've discovered is that those victims who have participated in a restorative justice circle have moved through that process. And a couple of things have happened. At least I've witnessed a couple of things that have happened. One is that they've been able to tell their story. They've been able to share the effect of this particular crime on them. And oftentimes the offender has never heard that. I think Nora alluded to that before, but to see two people sitting together, a young person that may have broken into somebody's house, and now they're sitting together, and the homeowner saying, I changed all my locks. I'm thinking of moving out of the neighborhood now because I'm so frightened that this may happen again. I sleep with the lights on, and I don't have my grandchildren come over because I'm afraid that this may happen again. And to see the offender's face, for once, realizing that the harm that this person has caused was not just breaking into somebody's house, but it also affected so many other people, this rippling effect of victimization. And then just to hear some tender stories that you stole something that was an heirloom, something that my mother had given me, and I'll never get it back. And for the offender to hear that, they were just breaking in, they were just trying to get something to sell. And there is this very unusual bond that takes place when these folks hear one another's stories, and when the offender can basically say, I'm sorry, I had no idea, and the idea is to have that consciousness then move into the future. So some of the more effective programs are those in which victims are involved, people who have been affected by crime, and yet there's a very important sensitivity to this, because there are some victims that probably will never want to see their offenders, particularly with sex-related crimes. And so we're very sensitive about not imposing on people that this may be an uncomfortable or provide discomfort for them, which is what Nora talks about a little bit of the surrogate program that's often the case inside prison. Nora, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, thank you. I'll start there, actually, because we do have, and actually, thank goodness for our partnership with Healing Hearts Restoring Hope, because they've been working with victims of major crimes for a lot longer than we have at Urban Mission Community Partners. There are people who are willing to speak and to share, because they believe that their healing journey will be helped in a setting where they can share their truth and have the safety of facilitators they know with them, and people who are listening to their story. The people who have committed, especially sex crimes, but really all of them, that they're terrified before this session starts, because they think that somehow hellfire and brimstone will rain down upon them. And what they encounter instead is a complex mix of forgiveness in process, but reality of people's values of wanting to heal, wanting society to heal, wanting another to heal, having empathy, because not only do those who are incarcerated for harm hear the story from a victim of his or her harm, being harmed, but those who have done harm in similar ways share their stories back. So there is this connection at the time, and it is crazy powerful. And so the same thing really works in that kind of group setting as well. Dean, I've also participated as clergy person in some of those restorative justice circles with juveniles, and you're exactly right. So often people don't realize the impact of the harm that they've done by something as simple as a break-in or a fire starting and then damaging a home. So the last thing I want to say about the victim-related work we do is in partnership with several other restorative justice organizations in the general LA area. We've begun doing what we call days of healing. They're carried out inside prison, and they are aimed at everyone who has experienced major harm, usually been the victim of homicide. And so those we bring in from outside are people who have lost loved ones to homicide. And those we bring in from inside have also lost a loved one or loved ones to homicide. And so think about it. How do hurt people become hurt people so they pass along the hurt? It's often the accumulation of traumas, but that can be something as dramatic as major harm or death to someone else. And so the healing there, as people share their stories of losing someone, it's just incomparably beautiful. And I give credit to the prison system for welcoming this.
Mm-hmm. I want to add one other thing, Nora, that your comments prompted with respect to victims being involved in this process. Not only is the process designed to just try to repair the harm and bring some healing and wholeness. But it allows some closure to this whole process. Oftentimes, people who are involved in the criminal justice system, particularly those who've been victimized by a crime, never have a sense of closure, that things are over, that things that they can move beyond that. And what I've discovered in restorative justice circles is that there is this sense that things have been brought to a close, that there's been some sense of redemption, there's been a sense of restoration, of reconciliation, then people can move on.
It's funny that you say that, Dean, because in our context, we specifically talk about the complicatedness of thinking and closure, because for people who have taken a life, especially, the worry is their own worry. So I'm voicing what I've heard from the people in the circles where I facilitate. Their worry is that they will forget. And so they don't want to forget. They just want right proportion. They want to be able to go on with their lives, to forgive themselves as much as they can, to make amends, to honor their victims. So that's where they go with this, is to say they'll speak the name of their victim. They'll honor the day that that person died or had major harm, and it becomes part of their reality. So thank you for raising that word, because in our context, it's handled a little bit differently or perceived a little bit differently.
Awesome. I have a couple of other interesting questions. One is a little different take. Do you have any resources for churches seeking to reconcile with members of the LGBTQ community? So how can restorative justice practices, I'm assuming, be used as tools of reconciliation in our communities?
I'll tackle that one. I've not had an opportunity to experience that, but being familiar with restorative justice practices and the incredible value of the circle process of restorative justice circles, I can really see the value of bringing people together who are struggling with some of those very issues of inclusion and acceptance and understanding, and also alienation, some of those issues that seem to continue to be visible in many of our churches, to get together and to have healthy conversations that are facilitated by individuals who understand that the process of dialogue is often a healing process in and of itself. One of the beauties of restorative justice circles is the use of something called a talking piece. And it's a way for the individual who holds that talking piece to hold the attention of the people around them, so that there can be some deep listening. I would think that if a congregation is struggling with those issues, to get sensitive people together who understand the principles of restorative justice circles, to engage in that conversation with a diverse group of people from that congregation or the community could be very, very valuable.
Mm-hmm. I'm intrigued. I'd love to see our churches try that. I'd love to be part of helping a congregation or congregations work on that.
Mm-hmm. Two other questions that I'm gonna pull them together. I think they have kind of similar take. Are how do you get small businesses to take part in restorative justice? How do you create that trust and inclusion in the community? And the other question is, how can the health sector help the efforts of restorative justice? So small businesses, community-based businesses, the health sector, what might their roles be in restorative justice in our communities? And how do you facilitate opportunities for creating trust and inclusion?
Well, in the Louisville community, there's been a really significant effort to create a restorative justice program in a community that really has identified itself as a compassionate community. And I've witnessed actual people from the business community who have been harmed by individuals participate in the restorative justice program, and so it becomes this community-wide event, and to encourage our community members to participate in to remind them that the cost of incarcerating a young person or an adult is about $20,000 to $25,000 a year per person. That if you're thinking in terms of dollars and cents, it's much more effective economically to try to address these issues early on and prevent people from getting into the system. And so there's been a number of community members from the legal community, from the religious community, from the justice community that got together and invited some folks from the wider restorative justice community to come and begin educating us about ways in which we could incorporate these principles in our community. And I think it's happening in a lot of communities across the country.
And I'd like to speak to the health aspect of it and health providers. There's a real potential because healthcare providers are involved in continuing education and they teach others. And so at Urban Mission, for instance, we have a partnership with Western University of Health Sciences. Mm-hmm. And their students have come and done part of a semester with us doing the short version of the ripple effect workshop, but without any offenders in the room, obviously, without those who have caused harm. And we bring in a victim, but we talk clearly about what harm looks like, and then they become sensitized to how that might play out in the different kinds of communities where they serve and are learning. They think about their friends and their families. They think about the people that they care for professionally and how their circumstances might benefit from restorative justice work. So that to me is an exciting and a growing opportunity to model how restorative justice and healthcare providers can intersect and do work together to promote the healthiness, if you will, of restorative justice.
Thank you both. We're drawing near our time. Just one last question, Nora. This is a bit of just a repeat of something you said earlier. You quickly said how long the workshops that you do last. Someone asked if you could say that again, and how long is each session? How often do they meet, and how long do the workshops span?
So the Insight Prison Project model of victim offender education group that we're doing at California Institution for Men is typically every week, 2 hours, because that's the time block, prison time block for education and activities. And anywhere from 18 to 24 months. That model, I know that different ways of doing that are now happening. It's happening once a month for 6 hours, basically for a whole day, across 12 months as the process gets systematized, if you will. But typically 2 hours is the length. And then for the ripple effect, it's 3 sessions. Now we're expanding it to 4 sessions, but that's for an introductory process. That's plenty. And then what we're working on now at Urban Mission Community Partners as new work, new models of subject-specific restorative justice inside prison. Probably the 2 hours a week for 15-week span, and then we'll move along to something else. But try to keep the group together, because building trust it takes time. So you need that time up front. So to develop a model where it's modularized, but then the group stays together across the different topics. If that helps.
Yeah. Nora, one last thing. Would you be willing to share your contact information for, there was at least one question of folks trying to get connected with you.
Sure. Yes. Should I say it out loud?
If you don't mind, and then we'll also add it.
I'm on a platform right now. It's NORA at, and then all one word, The Urban Mission, THEURBANMISSION.org.
Perfect. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Well, friends, this ends our webinar today. Thank you again for taking some time out of your day to join us in this conversation. Thank you for the great questions and dialogue. A special thank you to Dean and Nora for leading us. We invite you to please consider the many ways you, your congregation, your community might get involved or further your ministries in addressing prison and jail related issues, and in this case, restorative justice, its movement and its practices and principles. Today's webinar recording will be available on the NBA website for your convenience, so please share this resource with others. The NBA hosts monthly webinars with topics related to prison and jail ministries, the mental health initiative, and health and social services. Please check the website for more information on upcoming educational opportunities and registration. We'll be doing a joint webinar with Reconciliation Ministry in the month of September, late September. So we invite you to look out for more information on our website or on the site of Reconciliation Ministry. To get connected to the NBA Prison and Jail Ministries, please email Dean Bucalis at prisonministries@nbacares.org or visit nbacares.org/prison-and-jail. Remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and be in touch with us to learn more information about Disciples Health and Social Service Ministries. Thank you and have a great afternoon.